Thank you, everyone, for being here. If I will first want to thank everyone from Columbia that helped set this up and make this happen. Ashley, Mr. Amin, and everyone else involved that I may have not met or know personally. But it's an honor and a privilege to be able to speak with a few class members from the class of 61 from such a prestigious university, and hopefully we have a good time, drink a little whiskey, and you get to hear a pretty cool story along the way. So what I'll do is I like to give a background of my grandfather, Clyde May, because at the end of the day, that's who's most important in all of this. And to better know Clyde May is to better appreciate his whiskey when you consume it. So just a little information about him. Excuse me. My grandfather was born in 1922 in Southeast Alabama, a very, very rural area. And I can say that with positive, or I can say that officially because I grew up in the same rural area. I grew up out in the middle of nowhere, 2 houses down from where my grandfather grew up. And it's out just one of those small country communities in Southeast Alabama. And when he was 5 years old, he actually never knew his father, and his mother died when he was 5. So he was adopted and raised by his grandparents. And I only mention that because a lot of the difficulties he had growing up as a child were because of that, but he didn't let it define him in a negative way. It's something that helped define him and made him want to be a better person and provide a better life for his family when that day came. He's a World War II veteran, Purple Heart recipient, Bronze Star recipient with the U.S. Army in World War II. If anyone has happened to have seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge, which is based on the life of Desmond Doss, my grandfather and Desmond Doss were in the same infantry together. So if you've seen that movie, it gives maybe a better understanding of what all went on during those battles and the bloodshed and the war. And my grandfather was in the thick of it. But when he returned home and recovered from his injuries and began raising a family with my grandmother in 1946, as an extra source of income, he began making moonshine. It wasn't something that he ever did legally in his entire life. My grandfather, between 1946 and his death in 1990, never sold a legal bottle in his entire life. This was not, like you see on reality television or anything like that, where there's a hope or a dream to create a legal brand. He was just doing it to provide for his family in an area that didn't have a whole lot else to offer. And he did always have a full-time job. He was a farmer for many years. He was in the timber industry for many years, but moonshining was just an extra source of income to provide a more comfortable life. And he had a personality and a way about him where no matter what he did, he was determined to be the best at it. He was a perfectionist. And not just with whiskey making, but anything that he did. He was raised that if you're going to do something, even if it's building a barbed wire fence or building a birdhouse or making whiskey or cleaning up the kitchen after you cook dinner, you got to give it your all and do the best you can no matter what. So while most moonshiners were concerned about getting caught, and I'm not saying my grandfather wasn't concerned with getting caught, because of course he was, but most moonshiners would rush the process and do whatever they needed to do to turn around and make a quick buck. But while my grandfather did do it as an extra source of income, it quickly became a part of him. And he believed that his reputation was attached to every batch of whiskey that he sold. So in his mind, if he sold you a batch of whiskey that didn't meet his standard of excellence, in essence, he was selling you a lie, and he refused to do that. So from 1946 and 1990, he perfected his craft. And one of the most common questions I get, did he ever get caught? Yes, he got caught one time and actually served 8 months in prison in the early 1970s for making whiskey. So he did do his time, but those 8 months were the only time between 1946 and 1990 that he wasn't making his famous liquor. But in 2001, 11 years after he died, one of his sons, he had 8 children. One of his sons, Kenny May, started the brand legally. Kenny May's my uncle. And in 2004, it became the official state spirit of Alabama. Alabama's one of only 2 states with an official state spirit. For many years, it was the only state with an official state spirit. But now we're in all 50 states and a handful of countries. We're one of the fastest growing whiskeys in the United States. And I have to believe a huge part of that is because of, of course, the story of Clyde May. And, a big part of selling any product is marketing. But what's great about this story is that it's a true story. And I can say that because he lived it, my father lived it, and I lived it. I've been around whiskey making both legally and illegally my entire life. So it's something I'm quite passionate about, just like my grandfather was. It's just that I've decided to break the family tradition of getting arrested. I just do it legally nowadays. But with that, that's kind of a brief background of my grandfather that'll kind of help you appreciate what he was doing. I'll dive more into his actual distilling processes as we taste through. I know some of you got the little sampler pack, some of you didn't. Feel free. I'm going to walk through those products, and you're welcome to taste along or just listen. And at any point, if there's any questions you want to ask, you can do the raise your hand feature or type something in the chat or whatever you want to do to ask a question. Feel free to do that as well. But to start with, and let's see where my bottle is. So normally for those who are going to be tasting along, I like to start with the original Alabama style. It's this yellow label with the 85 number on it because it's 85 proof. Or 42.5% alcohol volume. I like to start with this one first because I like to sample products in order of proof. So I like to start with the lowest proof and work my way up to the higher proof. That way you're not jumping back and forth between proofs. And while you're, for those that are tasting, while you're getting your bottles ready, I'll give a little background on this product. So we call this our original Alabama style whiskey because it's our original recipe. This was what started it all for many, many years. This was the only product in our portfolio. This is technically, while Clyde Mays has many products, this is technically the specific product that is the official state spirit of Alabama. And what the term Alabama style means. So my grandfather, obviously, I'm sure most of you know, or maybe not, I maybe shouldn't assume that, but moonshine is often sold unaged. It's clear. They call it white lightning. And while a majority of what my grandfather sold was unaged white lightning, he actually took the time to age a lot of his moonshine into whiskey, which is something that no other moonshiner was doing. Because when you're aging something in a charred oak barrel, you're literally sitting on 53 gallons of evidence that can be discovered at any time. But like I said, he was dedicated to his craft and he wanted to try something different. And he began aging his moonshine into whiskey. He wasn't pleased with the initial product because he didn't have the luxury of aging it for as long as we do today to help mellow out that product. So he discovered through trial and error that adding oven-dried apple slices to the barrel at the very end of the aging process wouldn't necessarily flavor the product, but it would give it just enough of a finish to help smoothen it out and eliminate some of that spice and burn that you get on the back end of a lot of whiskeys and bourbon. So he was dedicated to doing something that made the product smoother without over flavoring it, because in his mind, anybody can make a terrible product but make it more palatable by just over flavoring it. In his mind, he worked very hard to make this a fantastic product on its own right, but he just took that extra steps to make it even smoother. So the term Alabama style, what this is a straight bourbon that is finished with a hint of apple. And once you add any kind of flavoring to a bourbon, you can no longer call it a bourbon. So that's why we call it Alabama style whiskey. And this is 85 proof, and it's a blend of 4 to 5 year old bourbons. But and with that, I'll shut up for a second to let anyone who's tasting. I want to give them the opportunity to taste without me talking in the background. And I'm going to taste along with you. I'll never let anyone drink alone, so I'm going to taste along with you as well.
LC, I just want to let you know that I've joined the call. Mr. A here.
Hi, Mr. Amin. How are you?
I'm good. We're trapped in a rainstorm and a heavy traffic, and I had trouble dialing in, but I'll be listening the rest of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hello, guys. Hello to my classmates.
Well, if at any point you would like to speak or say anything, please feel free to speak up, and we'll make sure to have a good time with everybody. So you didn't miss much. You know the history just as well as I do, and that's all we've gotten through so far is kind of the background. But the class right now is tasting the Alabama style, the original 85 proof. And like I said, if at any point there's any questions, let me know. But we'll most of the time I open up the floor for all the questions after we're tasting. However, if at any point any of you have a question during the tasting, please let me know. But with that, I'm sorry.
Can they hear me? Can they hear me now?
Yes, they can. Most of them are muted, but they can hear you. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And I got a question here. Do you recommend adding a few drops of water? That's actually more of a personal preference. Me personally, it depends on the product. So what I like to do, especially if I'm tasting a product for the very first time, I always try it neat first before I decide if I want to add any drops of water or any ice cubes or anything like that. I always try it neat, because a lot of times, especially when you drink enough bourbon and whiskey, you can kind of tell the difference between bourbons that need a little ice and maybe don't need a little ice. And normally in these lower proofs, you really don't need any drops of water. They pretty much stand on their own without having to add anything. It's normally when you get in the higher proofs, usually above 100 proof, I would say, when adding drops of water can really open it up and introduce new flavors and a different profile on the nose and on the palate and on the finish. But ultimately, everyone's palate is a little different and geared differently. So different people like to do different things. So it's always good to experiment with adding a few drops of water after you tasted it neat, in my opinion. But at the same time, to each is his own. But that's an excellent question. And let me make sure. I know there's a few in the chat here. I don't want to miss any questions. With the next product that we're going to taste, and this next product, we actually do have a pairing with it. I believe in your kits that you got some chocolate caramels and some mint cookies with the if it came in your kit. If it did with this bourbon, I would recommend trying the chocolate caramels with the bourbon. But really and truly, any of these snacks can pair with any of these products. But I do have different reasons as to why. But our straight bourbon, let me grab my bottle here, that way you can all see it. It's the white label. It's the one that has the 92 at the bottom because it's 92 proof or 46% alcohol volume. It is a straight bourbon. So I do want to clarify that Clyde Mays is arguably most famous for our Alabama style whiskey, because that's easily what makes us unique, or our most unique product. However, we only have that hint of apple in products that say Alabama style. So if it does not say Alabama style, then it does not have a hint of apple. It just is what it says it is. So in this case, this is more of your classic everyday straight bourbon whiskey. At 92 proof, it's definitely not too high, but it's definitely not too low either. It's kind of a nice midpoint for an everyday sipper. And it carries a lot of classic bourbon notes. For me, at least, as I mentioned earlier, you may get things that other people don't get, and that's fine. You don't have to get the same notes just because I get them, but I get a lot of vanilla and caramel and brown sugar spice on this product. And in general, chocolate and caramel are two things that you find most often when tasting bourbon. So that's why I think that chocolate and caramel will pair well if you want to snack while you're drinking. I think it'll pair well with it. But just like I did before, I'll shut up for a few seconds. That way you can taste and enjoy. So this product, I should mention, is I know that this glass is spread out all over the country. I'm not sure where. I will say our products are available in all 50 states. And depending on where you are, you'll probably have the most luck finding the straight bourbon, because it is our best seller nationally for many reasons. One being that you don't have to explain bourbon to people. They know what it is. Whereas with Alabama style whiskey, you kind of need a second to understand it. But we hope to change that. We hope that here soon, people will just automatically know what Alabama style is. But also too, bourbon is in general just a category that's on fire right now, and people enjoy it. And we have a fantastic bourbon. So wherever you live, before this class ends, this tasting, I am going to put my personal cell phone number and email in the chat. So if at any point you ask a question, or maybe after this is over, you think of a question that you would have liked to ask, or you're needing help locating a bottle, please feel free to reach out to me anytime. That's what I'm here for, is to help any way that I can. But before I don't want to move too quickly or anything, but before we taste the final of the sampler pack, were there any questions anybody had before we dive into the rye whiskey? Okay, well, with that, and I am going to circle back a little bit. I like to taste first and let people gather their thoughts on each product without overwhelming them with too much information. But once the tasting is complete, I am going to circle back and mention a couple other stories and fun facts about some of the things my grandfather was doing to stick out and be distinctive amongst his other competitors, a handful of other moonshiners that were distilling moonshine as well back in my grandfather's day. But last but certainly not least, and I believe my rye bottle is in my sample bag that's not next to me right now, but the bottle of rye whiskey is the only bottle left. It's the half green, half white or cream label. It's got the 94 on it because it's 94 proof. And this rye whiskey is going to taste most different versus the other two that you tried, or it's going to be the most different of the three altogether, because it's made the most differently. The first two were predominantly corn in the mash bill because they're either a bourbon or made like a bourbon, whereas this, with it being a rye grain, is the predominant grain in this mash bill, which rye tends to carry some boldness, some pepperiness, a little bit of spice. And because of that, in general, people have a love-hate relationship with rye whiskey. I just did a tasting last night in South Carolina, and a lot of the members of the bourbon group I was speaking to, they were like, yeah, I'm not going to try the rye. I don't drink rye whiskey. And I said, well, this rye whiskey doesn't carry as much spice as other rye whiskey. So I think it's definitely worth a try because it's much more mellow than your everyday rye whiskey. And this is also the one that if you got the little snack pack, the mint cookies, they pair well with this product because a lot of rye whiskeys carry a note of mint. It's a very common note found in rye whiskeys, just like how vanilla is a common note in bourbons. And our rye whiskey in particular, for some, not so much for me, when I'm tasting, I pick up more notes of honeysuckle and maybe a little bit of mint. But I have spoken with people who, when they taste this product, they pick up quite a bit of mint. So that's why I think the mint cookies pair very well with this product. But as I've done the 2 times prior, I'll shut up for a second to let you sip and gather your thoughts, and then we can talk about which one you all liked best. Okay, so I know most of you are on mute. If you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself and ask, or raise your hand, or put it in the chat, or whatever. But I would like to know, obviously, if you have any questions, fire them at me. But if nothing else, I would like to know, for the people who are on the call, which one your your favorite is. And Bob, I see you're having trouble with one of the caps. Was that the rye whiskey, the last one, or all of them that you had an issue with? I know you're on mute.
Just the last one.
Just the last one, the rye whiskey. Well, I can definitely see about sending you something. That way you will be able to taste it. I apologize. A lot of times with miniature bottles, the caps are made differently. So sometimes they can be a little defective like that. So my apologies to you, but we will make sure you get an opportunity to taste if you're unable to get the cap off. My apologies. But did anyone have a favorite of the ones they tried? If there was a certain one that stuck out or that you preferred more than the other? Let's see, Bob, I see you're holding something different.
Well, I'll just have to substitute a taste of Colorado honey whiskey.
Oh, Colorado honey whiskey. All right. Did you like any certain ones out of the 2? I know you didn't get to try the rye whiskey because of the cap issue, but did you prefer the bourbon over the whiskey, or the whiskey over the bourbon, or did you? What were your thoughts?
I thought the bourbon was exceptionally good.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. There's no wrong answer as long as you like at least one of them. But did anyone have any questions for me? Like I said, I'm happy. It can be any question about my grandfather, the distillation process, the products themselves, anything to do with just bourbon or drinking in general. Anything I can help with, I'm happy to answer.
I like the rye one.
Oh, great. So, yeah, like I said, rye can be a love-hate relationship.
She likes the bourbon.
Hey, like I said, no wrong answer as long as you like one of them. That's great to hear.
I thought the rye was very mellow.
It is, especially for a rye whiskey, because as I mentioned, a lot of rye whiskeys on the market today carry a bit of spice to it, and that's kind of off-putting to a lot of bourbon drinkers. So normally when I'm doing tastings around the country, obviously most of which were pre-COVID, I would have all our products on the table, and a consumer would come up to the table and they would either say, hey, let me try everything except your rye whiskey, or let me try your rye whiskey first. There was normally no in between. It's a very love-hate relationship, but I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed it. And I agree, it's very mellow.
Yeah, no, I didn't expect that, actually. I expected I wouldn't like it, but I liked it.
Yeah, there you go. Now, you never know until you try.
Also, it went very well with the cookies.
Yes,
the two help each other.
That's absolutely. I do my best to, depending on who you ask, obviously, pairings can get a little more complex, but what I try to do is find, because as I mentioned, everyone's palate is geared differently. You might pick up different notes that other people may not pick up. So I try to find the most common note and then pair it with a similar flavored candy or cookie or chip or whatever the case may be.
So, excuse me, I, I have a bottle, I don't know where I got it, but it's something called Plankinton Road Cedarbrook, and it's from that famous whiskey producing state, Wisconsin. And it was distilled in 1903 and bottled in 1914.
Oh,
And
wow.
I don't know what the proof, the label is a little bit faded, but I don't know what the proof is, but it's very sweet compared. I don't have your sample pack. I just didn't get around to ordering it, but um, it raises a question in my mind. You're talking about Alabama whiskey. Obviously, when people think about bourbon, they think about Kentucky, but also maybe Tennessee.
Right.
So are there regional differences that you can discuss generically or?
Well, usually speaking, there can be regional differences when it comes to bourbon, and normally those regional differences are due to weather, because obviously different regions have different weather. So when you're aging these barrels in a rick house, the reason people say Kentucky's the perfect place for bourbon, in addition to um, grain and water and soil and things like that. Kentucky has hot summers and cold winters, so it's kind of the perfect combination to age bourbon in. So when you're talking about aging, say, a bourbon in the state of Washington or Alabama or Florida or Texas, that's a different type of climate. So that product is going to age differently inside that charred oak barrel. But beyond that, for the most part, most distilleries get their barrels from the same place. Now, some smaller craft distilleries will get grain that they try to get as locally sourced as possible. However, in the grand scheme of things, for larger brands, most of them use the same companies to source their grains from, because grains like rye grow better in colder temperatures. So most rye that's sold to distilleries are grown in places like South and North Dakota and even Canada. So for the most part, there are, and then of course too, I'm sure you've heard that to make good whiskey, you have to have good water. And that's absolutely true. People talk about the limestone water in Kentucky, and that's what helps make it different. But ultimately, and this is probably more of an opinion than anything else, but I think a lot of master distillers will tell you this, that yeast that helps get the fermentation process started is actually more important to the overall flavor process than water or anything else is, other than the barrel. So I would say, different strains of yeast, and then depending on the climate you're aging your whiskey in, is going to be the two biggest factors that can make two bourbons taste differently depending on which region they're in.
The last thing I'll say about this bottle is it's over 100 years old, but it's really held up amazingly well.
Absolutely. The great thing of it, so whiskey is different than wine. Wine will still kind of age inside the bottle, so to speak, over the course of time. But with whiskey, as long as it has a decent seal and a good cork and is kept in a dry, cool or warm temperature place, the whiskey you taste out of that bottle today is probably very, very similar to exactly what it tasted like when people were drinking it in 1914. So that's what's really cool about whiskey. Now, of course, if there's a damage with the seal or the cork, and that allows more oxygen to get in the bottle, then it can change the flavor profile depending on how soon you notice it. It may help it in a good way, but if it sits there long enough exposed to the open air without being sealed, it normally will make will turn a whiskey or bourbon sour. So that's why people who normally come across these old dusty bottles, they're excited to see it, but the first thing they check is they want to see how tight the seal or the cork is, because they want to ensure that the whiskey has been preserved. But two great questions, though. were there any more questions about any? Like I said, I'm happy to answer anything about the bourbon making process, the my grandfather, our processes, or our products in particular. Anything you have, I'm happy to answer.
Certain products, certain whiskeys, bourbons, etc., have achieved substantial brand recognition. Do you think that's more due to marketing, or do they really? Can you really compare the qualities?
I think in most cases it's both. Now, I will say I do think some brands have had quite a bit of hype created with them due to excellent marketing. But ultimately, in my opinion, at the end of the day, if the liquid inside the bottle doesn't match the hype, so to speak, then people won't come back for more, thus kind of ending the hype. But it's in my experience that if a consumer pays $1 more for a whiskey or bourbon and they think it tasted like it was worth, so if they pay $50 for a bourbon and it tasted more like a $30 bottle of bourbon, I promise you 9 times out of 10 they're not going to buy another bottle. So most of the time when you have a bourbon or a whiskey that carries a lot of people who know it, or it's sought out, more often than not, it's both due to excellent marketing, word of mouth, but also the quality inside the bottle. Usually, like I said, there's an exception to every rule, but usually if it's very sought after, especially for extended periods of time, it's normally because it has good liquid in addition to good marketing.
In the Western movies, the standard Westerns, the cowboys go into the bar and they call for whiskey, and the bartender pulls out a bottle from under the bar and he pours whiskey into all the glasses. Assuming that actually was a real behavior at the time, what do you think they were drinking?
So actually, a lot of times back in, I know that's kind of how it's portrayed in movies, but bottling and selling whiskey by the bottle actually didn't really start to become a prominent practice until the early 1900s. Prior to that, most of the time, whiskey or bourbon was sold by the barrel, which is kind of how bourbon even got started. It was used, barrel was used as a storage container. And what they would do is they char the inside of the barrel to help seal the barrel even tighter to prevent any liquid from spilling out of it. And that was used as kind of transportation. And they would sell a barrel to a bar, and they would actually just, if you ordered whiskey, they would normally just pull it straight out of the barrel into a glass. But in terms of when selling whiskey by the bottle became more prominent, there's a handful of brands that probably would have been the most common product, most of which no longer exist. Unfortunately, Prohibition killed a lot of brands. Now there are several brands that have kind of been revived from those days of bourbon and whiskey, but for the most part, some of the more well-known ones no longer exist. To answer your question, actually, I think if it were more accurate in old Western movies, they should show the whiskey coming out of a barrel than they should bottle. So.
Thanks. One more question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Most of the brands I can think of are from English-speaking countries. Is there much of any good whiskey, rye, bourbon, whatever, coming from non-English speaking countries?
Well, bourbon specifically, by law has to be made in the United States. Now it is distributed internationally, but and that's not to say that somebody in Ireland couldn't make bourbon they just can't call it bourbon because bourbon is something that's unique to the United States. Just like with Scotch whiskey, you can make Scotch in the United States, but you can't call it Scotch. You have to call it American single malt whiskey. So for the most part, bourbon in general is a very hot commodity in a lot of non-English speaking countries right now, countries like Japan. But unfortunately, for them, they cannot actually make the products themselves and it be a bourbon. It does have to be made in the US, but there are, of course, with various countries, they have their own whiskey. You know, Japanese whiskey is quite popular right now. And of course, you have the well-knowns like Scotch and Irish whiskey and things like that. But bourbon, of course, since it's kind of a native spirit of the United States, is most popular in the United States, but it's a booming spirit worldwide as well.
LC, let me help you with this for a second.
Yes, sir.
The Japanese whiskey is quite good and growing in popularity. There's a shortage of it. The demand in Japan is such that the Japanese productive capacity is unable to supply the domestic, so their ability now to export is prohibitive. Suntory back in 2013 acquired the Jim Beam Company, and they are taking the Beam bourbon product into Japan in significant quantities, and they want through their Beam distribution in the U.S. to distribute Japanese whiskey, but they don't have enough of it. It's a pretty interesting situation there.
Absolutely.
But it's not bourbon.
Correct. You know, and due to the growth of whiskey as a category, all whiskey, you know, bourbon, Scotch, Irish is kind of seeing a boom here the last 5-10 years. So in places like the United States, Japanese whiskey is more sought after than it used to be. And then in places like Japan, bourbon is more sought after than it used to be. So a very interesting situation all around. Were there any more questions from anyone?
What goes into Irish whiskey?
So Irish whiskey can be made a couple of different ways, but and Mr. Amin, we actually have an Irish whiskey, a phenomenal one, McConnell's, and Mr. Amin may be able to touch on Irish whiskey even better than I can. My expertise is more in the bourbon and American whiskey side of things, but with Irish whiskey, it's they use, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Amin, but it's quite a bit of malted barley is used with Irish whiskey, correct? And then yes. And then there's other differences as well. For the most part, there are similarities in terms of distillation, but in Ireland, they're very big on pot stills. That's not to say that the United States or the bourbon industry isn't, but in the United States, we're more, the more popular still is actually what's called a column still, or it's also known as a continuous still. So there are you can find similarities between all whiskeys to some degree, whether it be the grain or how it was aged or maybe how it was distilled, but there's always, subtle differences that make them their own unique product as well. Any other questions from anybody? Got some good ones. I'm hope I answer everybody's question the way they want it answered. And but if nothing else, I do appreciate everyone being on this call this afternoon. And while I'm thinking about it, and like I said, feel free to ask a question at any time. But I'm going to put my email address and my personal cell phone number in the chat. That way, if you have any questions or want to find a bottle or anything like that, I can be of assistance. So Where was there? Yes, sir. I didn't know if somebody said something. Was somebody asking a question?
No, I just wanted to thank you for doing this. This was a very good thing to do.
Well, thank you very much. Well, if there's no other questions, I guess we can wrap this up. I want to thank Ashley again and her team for helping set this up. I want to thank all of you for being here and congratulate you on celebrating your class reunion. It was an honor to be able to speak to all of you today and this afternoon. And like I said, if there's ever anything I can be of assistance to, please let me know and feel free to reach out anytime. But if nothing else, thank you for enjoying a little whiskey with me today. I hope you all enjoyed it.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. And I hope to maybe we can do this one day in person once the dust settles on COVID a little bit. But if nothing else, I enjoyed my time this afternoon. Ashley, thank you again. And I hope I can meet you all soon. And please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Elsie. All right, everybody, have a great rest of your day and a lovely weekend. Thank you so much for being here.